Once a thriving city, eventually led to ruins, and now an archaeological marvel, the Roman city of Pompeii continues to bewilder researchers as it has for centuries. In 2024, researchers focused their studies on a previously unexplored part of the Regio IX, unearthing new discoveries that could change everything. Much more left to be discovered from the ancient Roman city. The excavation area focused on Insula 10 of Regio IX, which occupies the central part of Pompeii. Bounded to the north by the Via di Nola, to the west by the Via Stabiana, and to the south by the Via dell'Abbondanza. The site was first investigated in 1888, but was interrupted, partly excavated two atrium houses built in the Samnite period when Pompeii was conquered by the Samnites, an Oscan-speaking Italic people. Based on their discoveries, scientists were able to unearth a near modern-day laundromat and a bakery and found a couple of workbenches. It's believed that Regio IX might have doubled as the city center for the people of Pompeii before the city's inadvertent fall in 79 AD. More interestingly, however, archaeologists were able to unearth three well-preserved remains. It's believed that when the volcano erupted and engulfed everyone in Pompeii, 3 people, 2 adults, and a child of not more than 3 or 4, sought refuge in Insula 10. Based on their positioning underneath the workbenches, it's believed that the 3 entered the laundromat to protect themselves from the inevitable, but ultimately died when the structure collapsed on top of them. In the atrium of a house with an adjoining oven, 2 frescoes with scenes from Roman and Greek mythology have re-emerged, depicting Poseidon and Amymone in the first, and Apollo and Daphne in the second, in addition to traces of charred furniture due to fire that broke out during the catastrophe. The truth about the 2 maidens. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD, it wiped out several Roman cities, and with them, whole cultures, traditions, and a major chunk of history. However, it also froze time, especially for the people of Pompeii. It's believed that the thermal energy released from the volcanic eruption was several times more powerful than the World War II nuclear weapons used by the United States against Japan. In effect, no one could have survived even if they'd tried. What did happen, however, and it could be considered a silver lining years later as we try to learn more about the fascinating history of the Roman metropolitan area, is that their bodies remained well preserved. In the 1800s, archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli developed a method to make plaster casts of some of the victims. He poured liquid chalk inside the outlines left behind by the bodies, preserving the shapes of 104 people, and 2 of those remains belong to the 2 maidens. In the 1914 excavations at Pompeii, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 9 people in a garden. Among them, 2 were found holding each other closely. Fast forward to 2024, and scientists have revealed that one of the 2 maidens was actually a man. The maidens were locked in an embrace, clearly indicating their final moments of distress as they waited for the inevitable. At the time, back in 1914, it was believed that all 9 of the bodies found in the garden belonged to women. It wouldn't have been uncommon for women to visit the gardens, typically more so than men. However, with modern methods and innovations in genomic studying, scientists were able to prove that at least one of the maidens was a man, leading to much discourse that the 2 maidens were actually 2 lovers. Still, we don't know that for sure. While it's possible that the other body could still belong to a woman, the idea that they were lovers will probably never be proven. That's because at the time of the volcanic eruption, people sought cover wherever they could and found comfort in whoever they could. The unrelated mother and child discovered at Pompeii. Victims of the eruption were entombed in the ash and pumice that spewed from Vesuvius. As their soft tissue disintegrated, body-shaped cavities were left behind in the volcanic deposits. Archaeologists in the 19th century perfected a technique of filling these holes with plaster, producing perfect casts of the dead. They guessed at the age and gender of the little groups of victims, coming up with backstories and names for them. The group of 2 adults and 2 children was dubbed the family of the House of the Golden Bracelet, while the 2 supposed women, calcified forever in a last embrace, were named the 2 maidens. However, earlier assumptions about these remains were based on little more than stereotypes. For example, we already talked about the truth behind the 2 maidens, but did you know that the story of the golden bracelet was also based on the stereotype that only women wore jewelry? That's right, Genomic testing in 2024 revealed that the body of the woman with a gold bracelet and a child attached to her hip was actually that of a man. Better yet, it's believed that the child and adult were wholly unrelated. This has led to new backstories, some that suggest it was a master and a slave seeking refuge in their final moments, and others that suggest people tried to protect any child they could find in those catastrophic final moments. The skeleton child tried to escape. You can't help but wonder how different the world would have been had Mount Vesuvius never erupted. Excavations at Pompeii have unearthed a modern-day way of living, a thriving city hub, and technology that is mirrored in 2024. Unfortunately, everything was left in ruins when the volcano erupted in 79 AD. During their excavations, first starting in the 19th century, archaeologists also unearthed an incomplete bath. This thermal bath was meant to mimic Emperor Nero's illustrious bath. Only the people of Pompeii wanted theirs to be bigger and better. Excavations led to the discovery of several baths, arguably lighter than the ones Nero is well known for. Well, for that and a few other things. In any case, the site was left untouched for several centuries until it was re-excavated in 2012. This was in anticipation of opening Pompeii as a tourist destination sometime in the future. However, after discovering just how much earlier archaeologists had missed, the opening was delayed till 2019. The central baths lie in an area that has been restored as part of the so-called Great Pompeii Project, which began restoring the city in 2012 after the collapse of the 2,000-year-old House of the Gladiators, which sparked worldwide outrage. Archaeologists who excavated the central baths called it an emotionally charged experience, not just because of the what-ifs of it all, but because they found the skeletal remains of a child hunched up into a ball in one of the baths. Genomic testing revealed that the child couldn't have been more than 10 years old at the time of his demise. This might have been the only case where a backstory perfectly fit. It's believed that when everyone sought cover from the volcanic ash, this child wound up in the central bath. It's believed that he tried to wait out the disaster for as long as he could before ultimately attempting to escape. However, he wasn't as lucky. No one was. The unluckiest man in Pompeii? You might think it's impossible to label any one of the several hundreds of victims of Pompeii as the unluckiest. But having your skull crushed in the midst of the panic could very well earn a man that title. And it has. Scientists unearthed the remains, or, well, partial remains, of a man not more than 40 years old, as his torso and leg were seen dangling out, and his upper body was crushed by a rock. The man's body was found at the junction of the Silver Wedding and Balcony Alley, sufficiently away from the city center. This led many archaeologists to speculate that he could have escaped, had it not been for the boulder that ultimately killed him. However, as you've probably come to know, nothing is as it seems at Pompeii. In this case, for example, the man was labeled the unluckiest Pompeii victim because he got crushed by the boulder that kept him from reaching safety. Testing showed that he couldn't have reached safety even if he'd tried, even if the boulder never fell on him. In fact, many scientists have claimed that the boulder crushed him after the fact. That's right when he was already deceased. Testing showed that the man had a severe bone infection in his leg up to his tibia. This would have hindered his escape from the volcanic ash. He probably tried his hardest, fighting against the pain, but ultimately was no match for the pyroclastic flow. Still the unluckiest man, but maybe more so in a different context. The House of Phaedra, aka the House of Erotic Frescoes. The people of Pompeii were many things, but they weren't prudish. As such, a recurrent theme found in the many, many frescoes unearthed from the ancient Roman city illustrates sexual themes. Maybe the most famous of these frescoes was found at the House of Phaedra, an exquisitely decorated abode named after the mythological queen of Athens. The vividly colored wall paintings include one depicting a sexual encounter between a satyr and a nymph on a bed, and one of a scantily clad Phaedra and her stepson Hippolytus, whom, according to Greek legend, she accused of assault after he spurned her advances. Another fresco features gods presumed to be Venus and Adonis. The House of Phaedra isn't only well-renowned for its erotic art, but it's also one of the very few dwellings that survived the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. That might be because the house was not built around the traditional atrium. a central courtyard with a pool used for collecting rainwater that was typical of Roman architecture from the 6th century BC. As we said, the people of Pompeii were not prudish, which meant that the House of Phaedra, now a spectacle for modern people, was actually one of the several such erotic dwellings in the city. Have you heard of the House of the Vediae? It was believed to have been owned by two men freed from slavery, and where a phallic structure was discovered in a largely preserved state during excavations in the late 19th century. The House of the Tragic Poet. The volcanic ash achieved two things. It wiped out the city of all its inhabitants and preserved everything in a near pristine state. Archaeologists are thankful for one of the two, or maybe in hindsight for both. In any case, moving on with the discoveries of dwellings you could only ever find in Pompeii, we have the House of the Tragic Poet. This proved to be, and continues to be, one of the city's most famous residences, celebrated for its exquisite mosaics and frescoes that offer a glimpse into Roman artistic culture and daily life. Though relatively small compared to grander homes like the House of the Faun, its intricate decorations make it a standout discovery. This house gained fame for its cave canem mosaic located at the entrance. The phrase, Latin for "beware of the dog," is inscribed beneath the image of a black guard dog, which seems to spring to life with its realistic posture and detailed craftsmanship. This mosaic, a likely warning to visitors, exemplifies Roman wit and practicality, as well as their mastery of mosaic art. One of the most renowned frescoes is a depiction of scenes from Greek mythology, showcasing the stories of Achilles and Briseis and the tragic fate of Iphigenia. These artworks suggest that the owner was educated and cultured, with a taste for dramatic themes from classical literature. The emphasis on theatrical and mythological motifs is likely what inspired the modern name of the house, associating it with tragedy. But that begs the question, who was the tragic poet? The identity of the owner is unknown, and it'll probably stay that way forever. However, the lavish decoration indicates a wealthy patron who wanted to project sophistication and status. The smaller size of the house compared to others in Pompeii suggests that the owner prioritized artistic refinement over grandeur. The Villa of Mysteries and the Cult of Dionysus. Wine, music, dance, and rebirth. These were the tenets of the mysterious cult of Dionysus. To preface, Dionysus was the mythological god of, well, wine and theatrics. Not much is known about this mysterious cult, or even if it existed, but archaeologists have a strong suspicion that something was happening at the Villa of Mysteries. As it stands today in its well-preserved state, the Villa of the Mysteries is one of the most enigmatic and celebrated archaeological sites from the Roman world, renowned for its stunning frescoes that provide insight into the cult of Dionysus. Located just outside the city walls, this luxurious villa combines residential and agricultural functions, showcasing the wealth and status of its ancient owners. However, its true fame lies in the frescoes adorning one of its rooms, widely believed to depict rituals associated with the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and theater. The frescoes, painted in the second style of Roman wall painting, cover all four walls of a large room, known today as the Initiation Chamber. These vibrant images, dating to around 60 BCE, are remarkably preserved and vividly portray a sequence of life-sized figures engaged in what appears to be an initiation ceremony into the Dionysian mysteries, a private, esoteric cult centered on personal transformation and liberation. The cult, popular among women and elites in Roman society, promised spiritual enlightenment and communion with the divine through rituals involving wine, music, dance, and dramatic reenactments of Dionysian myths. The people of Pompeii and religion. With little to no information on volcanic eruptions, their timelines, and any details that could explain the catastrophe of Pompeii, many Romans believed that the people of Pompeii had evoked the wrath of God, or gods in this case. The people of Pompeii were not known for being particularly religious, although, under Roman rule, they were required to worship traditional gods. As such, the Temple of Jupiter was constructed at the north end of the Forum when Pompeii came under Roman rule. Still, when the temple was destroyed in an earthquake, it was not enthusiastically built, just enough to appease the emperor, but not as well as it should have been for a highly motivated population. This isn't to suggest, however, that the people of Pompeii weren't religious. It's true that the inhabitants of Pompeii and Herculaneum seem to have had a pastiche of national deities, little gods, cults, and foreign religions. Romans believed that their gods had human-like feelings and had the power to destroy people if they did not satisfy them with offerings and worship. This might explain the frescoes found at the Villa of Mysteries and the House of Phaedra. The people of Pompeii believed that religion was more so about letting go and submitting. Venus, however, was worshipped avidly as seen by the many images which appeared of her throughout the city's public spaces. Pompeii's love for the goddess of love stemmed from the Sulla, Pompeii's Roman conqueror who dedicated the town to her. The rebuilding of the Temple of Venus after the earthquake had barely begun before the Vesuvian eruption buried it in AD 79. A day in the life of someone living in Pompeii. Everyday life in Pompeii and Herculaneum closely resembled life in other Roman colonies. Families were patriarchal, with the father as the head of the household and slaves at the bottom of the hierarchy. Roman families were larger than those of today, including children, slaves, and servants. Women had limited control over their lives, being considered the property of their fathers until marriage, after which they became their husband's property. Divorce was only possible under specific circumstances. Wealthy boys were educated, while children from poorer families worked alongside their parents. Women typically worked as hairdressers or midwives, and daughters were taught skills necessary for family life. Roman weddings began with the bride offering childhood toys to the family shrine, followed by a sacrificial ceremony to ensure divine approval. Afterward, a feast took place, and the groom carried the bride over the threshold to signify her transition to his care. Food habits were simple during the day, with Romans eating a small morning meal and reserving a larger, lavish meal for the evening. Poor citizens ate bread, porridge, or stew, while the wealthy indulged in fruits, eggs, cheese, meat, and honey. Sugar was absent from their diets, and honey was rare. Wine, made from the fertile lands around Campania, was abundant, though it was diluted with water to maintain respectability. Pliny the Elder noted the strength of Pompeian wine, warning of its ability to cause headaches. Wealthy citizens enjoyed elaborate evening meals with strict etiquette, such as limiting guests to 9 and following specific dining customs. Unlike in Greek culture, Roman women could attend these dinner parties. Etiquette rules were inscribed on walls, such as in the House of the Moralist, advising against improper behavior or offensive language. Fashion in Pompeii and Herculaneum revolved around wool, often dyed in bright colors. Fulleries, like the Fullery of Stephanus, were centers for cleaning and dyeing clothes. Men wore tunics and ceremonial togas, while women donned stolas with shawls called pallas. Men kept clean-shaven faces and simple haircuts, while women curled their hair with heated irons and used lead-based makeup, unknowingly exposing themselves to lead poisoning. Medicine was somewhat advanced, with doctors, often slaves or freedmen, using tools like pincers for treating wounds. However, there were no anesthetics, and remedies like rosemary and sage were used for pain relief. Citizens primarily relied on prayers to the gods for healing. Did anyone from Pompeii survive? Pompeii may not have been the center of the ancient Roman world, but it was nonetheless an important hub in Campania, a region bordering the Bay of Naples. Pompeii's population was somewhere between 6,400 and 30,000 people. Earthquakes were a part of life in Campania. In fact, in AD 79, Pompeii was still rebuilding from a powerful earthquake that had rocked the city 17 years earlier, damaging or destroying many buildings. You'd think that, as a city constantly on the brink of survival, the people of Pompeii would have been better equipped to deal with tragedy, right? However, earthquakes were relatively commonplace, and the people knew how to survive when the world shook. But what if it stood still? The volcanic eruption was one that no one could have predicted back then, even if they'd tried. Earthquakes saw at most 100-some-odd casualties, but the disaster of Pompeii took out its entire population. Well, almost the entire population. It's believed that over 200 people, or more, survived, one of whom was Pliny the Younger. He was 18 at the time of the disaster, and was with his mother at his uncle's villa in Misenum, a town across the bay from Pompeii and 18 miles west of Mount Vesuvius. When the eruption began, Pliny recalled seeing a cloud of gas and debris spewing from Vesuvius. Pliny and his mother were among those around the Bay of Naples who ran. He recalled that, as darkness and ash settled on the survivors, chaos reigned. You might hear the shrieks of women, the screams of children and the shouts of men, calling for their children, others for their parents, others for their husbands, seeking to recognize each other by the voices that replied. Pliny and his mother weren't the only survivors, though. Some believe that 200 people survived, and some argue that well over several thousand made it out alive. But the bigger question remains: where did they go? The obvious destination included towns and cities around Campania, where friends and family may have offered shelter. In recent years, classic scholar Stephen L. Tuck discovered that at least 5 families from Pompeii relocated to Neapolis after the eruption. He painstakingly traced the migration of likely survivors through their family names, which were unique to Pompeii. He located these names on tomb inscriptions in places around Campania after AD 79. Other communities that became home to Pompeii's survivors included Cumae and Puteoli. It's also believed that Titus, emperor from AD 79 to 81, sprang into action after news of Vesuvius's eruption reached Rome. According to ancient biographer Suetonius, Titus displayed not merely the concern of an emperor, but also the deep love of a father, whether by offering messages of sympathy or by giving all the financial help he could. Why was Pompeii never rebuilt? As tourists flock to the archaeological remains, bewildered by the greatness of the Roman city, they only have one question to ask: why did no one try to reclaim the great city? The volcanic eruption might have been catastrophic, yes. However, with its vast resources, why didn't anyone from the Roman capital ever try to rebuild the great city? If Titus was as devastated as texts claim he was, why didn't he attempt to give back the survivors a sense of familiarity by restoring Pompeii? These questions come to mind particularly when you notice the well-preserved state of the city. Surely, it'd be a labor of love to rebuild the great city, right? Well, the city was never rebuilt for a multitude of reasons, and lack of resources would be at the very bottom of the list. It was primarily due to the overwhelming scale of destruction, the extensive loss of life, and the hazardous conditions of the area. The volcanic eruption buried the city under layers of ash and pumice, preserving it but rendering it uninhabitable. The eruption not only destroyed Pompeii's buildings and roads, but also blanketed the surrounding area, making agriculture and trade, the lifeblood of the city, nearly impossible. The thick volcanic deposits contaminated water sources and covered fertile lands, forcing survivors to seek refuge in nearby towns such as Naples, Cumae, and Puteoli, where they could rebuild their lives. That might explain why Titus was more concerned about rehoming the survivors in surrounding cities than he was about giving them back the exact homes that they had lost. Additionally, Vesuvius remained an active volcano, posing a continued threat to any potential rebuilding efforts. The fear of another eruption likely played a significant role in deterring resettlement in the area. Italy to cap, daily tourists to Pompeii to 20,000. Speaking of tourists, if you were planning on visiting the ancient city, you'd have to act quickly. Authorities at Pompeii, Italy are setting a daily cap of 20,000 visitors to protect the ancient site. By late 2024, personalized tickets with each visitor's name will be issued. And during the busy seasons, visitors must book a specific time slot if they want to visit all of Pompeii in its lost glory. But why the sudden cap? The change was necessary after the city clocked a record-breaking summer with over 4 million visitors. Estimates suggested that on its busiest day, Pompeii saw a total of 36,000 people coming and going by the hour. Authorities have claimed that the cap is a necessary and precautionary measure to protect the site, reduce strain on the fragile architecture, and preserve Pompeii's heritage. Safety also plays a huge role in this. The area was, and still is, highly susceptible to earthquakes. Altogether, the cap was to create a more sustainable and enjoyable tourist experience.